Okay, so our scripture reading comes from Matthew 25, verse 31 to 40. When the Son of Man comes into his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him he will be gathered on all the nations, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I, for I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer there, "Truly, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me."
Operation Blue Star was an Indian military operation which occurred between June 1 and June 8 of 1984. It was ordered by the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in order to establish control over the Golden Temple, the holiest Gurdwara or temple, the pilgrimage site of Sikhism, which is located in Amritsar in Punjab, northwest India. The objective was to remove the militant armed followers from the complex. The operation was carried out by the Indian Army troops. My colleague, who was the chief executive officer of the Adventist Hospital in Shimla, high up in the Himalayas, knew the Army general in charge, and the headquarters was just down the road from the Adventist Hospital. His wife reported to my friend that the general came home with his uniform drenched in the blood of his soldiers. The published casualty figures from the army was reported as 83 dead and 249 injured. But the general said that unofficially, many more were hurt. The troops were ordered not to fire at that temple complex, and that made their task almost impossible. Assaults, the Operation Blue Star, led to assaults on members of the Sikh community throughout India as everybody reacted to the news of what was happening. 4 months later, on the 31st of October 1984, at 9:20 in the morning, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was walking down the garden of her residence in New Delhi. She was assassinated by two of her bodyguards, who were members of the Sikh community, in what was viewed as an act of vengeance. One was killed almost immediately on the spot, and the other was eventually hanged in 1989. I was living in India at the time, and we didn't hear of the news of the assassination until 10 hours later on the TV news. Subsequently, more than 3,000, some say as many as 8,000 people who belonged to that religion, the Sikh religion, were killed in the ensuing anti-Sikh riots that broke out across the country. And the most affected region was in New Delhi, where I lived. My colleagues and neighbors reported that from the top of our apartment building in New Delhi, You could turn 360 degrees and see flames and smoke as Delhi erupted in an orgy of violence. I happened to be traveling outside of Delhi during that week, and so I didn't see what was happening. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was cremated on the 3rd of November, and Rajiv Gandhi, her son, lit the pyre. Rajiv, who had been up until that moment an airline pilot, was immediately sworn in as the new prime minister after his mother's death. And when asked about the riots, he commented, "When a big tree falls, the earth shakes." The shaking also included those of us in the Adventist office. Surely there's something we can do about the poor victims of the riots that are taking place, we asked as we heard about all of the thousands of households that were left destitute as the homes were burnt down. "Yes," replied another. "Isn't there something called, ADRA, that the church has started, and that can provide funds for an emergency response?" "Ah," replied a third person, "but they need something called a proposal." At least they knew that much. It seemed then that everybody turned to me. "Your mother tongue is English. You'd better write this proposal," was the agreed conclusion. I didn't know what a proposal was, apart from that was something when you asked a lady to marry you. But I found that a proposal was a written document where you asked for money. So using the modern technology of the time, that was a manual typewriter, a glue pot, some scissors, I cut and pasted and edited my very first proposal, which became my very first project. Thus, in 1984, my life in ADRA began. Now, we have others in our congregation who have worked and are working in ADRA, and their story undoubtedly will be different. I'm just sharing you, as I was asked, my story. Another consequence of Operation Blue Star was that my stay in India, which did not require a visa at that time, came to an end. The government said everybody needed a visa. So, since the Northern Union Territory where I worked at that time included the countries of Nepal and Bhutan, I moved to Kathmandu in Nepal. Although I continued my job as a Union Departmental Director, I also became involved in other humanitarian activities. And working with the various government bodies, I eventually was able to register ADRA Nepal as an NGO. That's a term that in my world we always use, non-government organization. And I made the arrangements for the first ADRA Nepal projects and for the leadership. But, once again, I lost my visa, and it became obvious to me that it was time to return to Canada. And so I pastored 2 churches, one in St. Albert, the other in Edmonton, and my mentor and leader at that time was none other than our own Pastor Don Corkum. But ADRA was still in my blood, and 4 years later, I was back in India as the Associate Director for ADRA India. And this involved lots of administrative work, getting ADRA India registered with the government, and so forth. But one of my strongest memories of the time was our response to a big earthquake that occurred in the Himalayas at that time, in Uttarkashi in particular. This earthquake was 6.1 on the Richter scale, and thousands of people were affected, especially because in that area, those people who had managed to build better homes had built concrete roofs, but still had stone walls. And so the earthquake caused the walls to wobble and collapse and the concrete ceiling to land down, killing mostly men because the women were out doing their work. This is how I described my reaction at the time.
For many people, it's been very devastating. They have no other forms of security. So when they woke up on the morning of the 20th to discover that their homes had been destroyed, their livestock had been endangered, and even their crops had been put at risk, they felt utter despair.
Our ADRA India response at that time was ultimately significantly helped by support from ADRA Canada. And Pastor John Howard, who is the great man who invented ADRA Canada, he came out and he helped. In fact, at one point, I remember we climbed up into about 45 minutes into the mountain area to find the village. And the next village was another 2 hours climb up into the mountains, and he told me, "You're a young man, you can run up there and do that." But I remember that sometime later we had some volunteers who came out on a mission trip from the Church of Redding in California in the US. And they helped to build some wooden structures that would be earthquake-proof. And one day I was taking a break and sitting with an old man, one of the men who had survived the earthquake. And he asked me, and I tried to respond in my broken Hindi. He said, who are these people? I said, well, that man with the hammer there, he's a medical doctor. That woman over there, she's a nurse. And that person with a saw, he's a teacher, and so on. And he said, you mean they're not builders? I said, no. And he said, why have they come? So I explained that we believed in God and that we were all brothers and sisters, and it was our responsibility to come and help. He shook his head. In his Hindu philosophy, he could not understand how anybody would do this. By 1993, I was transferred to ADRA Sri Lanka, and I found life much the same as in India, but also very different. Let me tell you a couple of stories. I was in my office one day, and we heard about a disaster that had occurred. And so we organized some relief supplies, and with various vehicles and my staff, we went out to this village. It was about half a day's journey from the capital. When we got there, we spoke with the leader of the village and said, look, we have enough supplies for about 50 families. Can you please tell us who's most in need? And they said, oh, we have 100 families that are desperately in need. We said, we don't have enough for 100. Can you please choose 50? So eventually 50 people got in a line, and they came in, they received all the goods that we had. We had food and cooking utensils and so forth. And they moved off. Well, we were packing up the vehicles, and I heard a bit of a noise, and I went around behind the Buddhist temple, and I saw something that will stick with me for all my life. Those 50 people had met up with the heads of the other 50 families, and they were sharing, so that all 100 families in need received something. Maybe not the full package, but something. And I thought the generosity of the people who donated to ADRA is now being multiplied. Let me share another story. Again, I was in my office, and some people came, and I didn't speak the local language, I'm afraid, and so one of my staff translated, and these were people from, let's call it Village B. I couldn't pronounce the name of the actual village. And they said, thank you for all that you did for us. I said, we haven't done anything. And I asked my colleague, I said, did we do anything in this Village B? No. So I said, find out what's going on. So eventually, after talking, he said to me, you know, some time back, we responded to the people in Village A, and we helped them. And now the village the people in Village B, they desperately needed a dam to save water for their gardens. And so the people from Village A came across and said, you know, ADRA helped us. Now it's our turn to help you. And so they helped them to build this dam. And we were now being thanked for it. And I thought, once again, the blessing is being multiplied, even when I didn't even know about it. By 1995, I was in the Philippines, and those of you who know anything about the Philippines, and we've just prayed for that country, they seem to have more disasters than they should have. Cyclones and floods. I was in a cyclone once. It's not a very pleasant experience. And we tried to perfect our abilities to respond to people who are in disaster, as well as those who needed help from community development. Well, one story from the Philippines. There was a volcano with a lake inside the volcano. The volcano was, of course, not working at the time. But one of the walls, the side of a volcano, collapsed, and that lake rushed out and poured down across the countryside. It found its way into a river and roared down the river, and tragically swallowed up many villages that were on the way. We came to respond as ADRA Philippines, and in consultation with the government, it was decided that we would build a new village with their help, but with our support and with funding and expertise that ADRA was able to provide. And I could tell you more about that story, but I'm going to move to the end. It was time for the end of the project, and as often happened, I came to inspect how the project had gone. And this, to my horror, is what I found. And I went to the project leaders and I said, you can't do this. They said, oh, the village leaders all voted to call it the James Astleford Village. I said, okay, well, I'm really very flattered, but can we change the name, please? But let me just take a picture first before you change the name. One day when I was in the Philippines, one of our professors in one of the Adventist institutions came to me, and with an angry look on his face and an angry expression in his voice, he asked me how many baptisms ADRA had conducted in the previous year. And I told him none. And he was very upset. I explained to him, you know, our church has many different ministries. We have schools and hospitals, and we have ADRA. And some of these don't do the baptizing and evangelizing. So ADRA is the agency of the church that responds to need and shows people that God cares. But of course, other agencies of the church can respond by following up with baptism. And it just so happened that a few days later, we had a group of volunteers come from Japan to help out. And the ADRA Japan director was with me for some days, and he told me, you know, when we get back to Japan after having had these mission trips, we often have a lot of the young people who ask for baptism. So I thought, well, yeah, probably. That's not surprising. He said, but you know, most of the young people in our group aren't Adventists. Oh, I said, I thought these were all Adventist young people from the college or the churches. No, he said, lots of young people, they hear about us and they come out, and then afterwards they want to be baptized. And I say to them, what do you know about the 27 fundamental beliefs? And have you studied? Oh, no, he said, they said, we don't worry about that. We'll sign anything. We know that you are a church that cares. We don't know anybody else who does things like this. So we want to be a part of your church. Yeah, well, we'll take the Bible studies, but please, we want to get baptized. And I thought that was so wonderful because it wasn't the answer that I always expect, but it helped me to understand that people catch a vision of caring that makes a difference. By 1998, I was in South Sudan in East Africa. These were war years with unbelievable horrors and anxious moments. Once I was held up by two angry young men who pointed their AK-47s at me, and I thought it was the end of my life on this planet. Another time, my ADRA colleagues in one of our centers in the southeastern part of South Sudan were kidnapped in the middle of the night, and they were held hostage for over 2 months, during which time they didn't know if anyone cared about them. They were in severe trouble. But let me tell you some more positive stories about South Sudan. Once I was in a particular place called Chukudum, and my predecessor had arranged for projects to be held in that area for some years. And we were continuing that work. It was evening, and I went out onto a huge rock that was on the side of the village, overlooked the village, and sitting up there was one of the elders of the village. And we sat there for a while. I can't remember today if we spoke in English or if I had a colleague who was translating, probably the latter. And finally the elder looked at me and he said, "You know, when you ADRA people came, we didn't like you." Oh, it wasn't the usual response that I have learned to expect. I said, "Tell me more." He said, "Yes, you know, we had other NGOs come here, and they gave us things. And you ADRA people, you hardly gave us anything. You just expected us to work on the roads or build the clinic or do various activities." Again, I said, "Oh?" He said, "But you know, those other NGOs, they've gone now. And the things they gave us, they're gone too. But what you brought us, you trained nurses, you trained our young people. If you go tomorrow," oh, by the way, I don't want you to go tomorrow, but if you go away tomorrow, we'll be grateful because our life is better now." And I thought that was a good testimony to making sure that we stay with people and make a difference. Let me share with you one of the most powerful moments of my stay in South Sudan. It was war years, as I told you, and there were, you might call them refugees, we call them IDPs, internally displaced people. And we came across this group of internally displaced people who had walked for weeks to get away from the western part of the country to the eastern part, to get away from the fighting and the bloodshed that was occurring. By the time they got to this particular area where ADRA was working, they had nothing. And so we organized a clinic, and for several days, my colleagues, and some of them were nurses and other health workers, were there helping them with their medical needs. There were about 200 of them, and they were under one of those gigantic trees. I don't know the name. My wife knows names of animals and plants. I don't. I just know it was a big tree. And they were all under the tree, and this woman came up and she spoke to me. She spoke to me in the most beautiful BBC quality English. This woman didn't have anything. She was completely naked. She didn't even have clothes. And she said to me, "Thank you, sir, for coming here. We're so grateful for your help. We appreciate all that you've done for us." I felt about that tall. I said, where are you from? And she explained to me which town she was from, way in the west of the country. I asked her, "Where did you learn to speak this beautiful English?" I felt like she was speaking better English than I was. She said, "Oh, I went to a church mission school where I grew up. And so I'm now here. I'm able to speak English, and I want to thank you for all that you have done." She was thanking me. I felt I should be on the ground bowing in front of her for the tremendous sacrifices that she had gone through. And I thought, what a comfortable life I was living. Yes, I was out in the bush, but I knew that in a few days I would get in a four-wheel drive and get back across the border, and I'd get in a plane and I'd get to Nairobi and I'd have a shower and food and clothes and everything else. And here was this woman with nothing thanking me. It was a special moment as I thought of what the ADRA ministry was doing. Well, after South Sudan, it was back to Canada. And I worked in the ADRA Canada office in Ontario. Some of you know, for a number of years, I had the privilege of leading the team in the office there. What are the highlights of that period of my life? Well, let's talk about a couple here in Alberta first. The High River floods of 2013. Some of you may have been involved in that. It was especially exciting when we talked with the conference leadership and they worked with us. We organized some buses because it was camp meeting time. And we advertised, anyone who's not doing anything, why don't you come to High River and let's help out? And every day our buses were full as volunteers came down to High River and helped with the other volunteers cleaning out muddy basements. I slipped over and bent my hand at one point and sorted out all the relief goods and everything else, just making a difference for that community. Then in 2016, we had the very frightening fire in Fort McMurray. And some of you may not be from there, but you may have seen the videos from the time. And let me tell you something of what happened then.
As the long recovery effort continues, the province and RM of Wood Buffalo have decided to hand over control of donations for Fort McMurray residents to the Adventist Development and Relief Agency Canada, or ADRA for short. James Astleford is the executive director and joins us now in studio. Hello, James.
Hi, Adrian.
Tell us exactly what ADRA Canada will be doing with all the donations.
ADRA Canada, in partnership with the province of Alberta and the local municipality, will be receiving all of the donated goods that are coming from warm-hearted Edmontonians and actually from across the country, and sorting them, packing them, making sure that everything is appropriate, and then ensuring that they're delivered to those who need them.
Yeah, and that's a big job because we've seen where they're all being held and there are a lot of donations.
Yes, a lot coming in, and we hope more will continue to do so.
Yeah.
On the province's website, they list the needed goods, and as we go forward in the next weeks and months, we will be updating that list so that in real time we'll be painting a picture of what's really needed.
Now tell us what exactly ADRA Canada is all about.
ADRA Canada is part of the worldwide network of ADRA, or the Adventist Development and Relief Agencies, operating in over 120 countries. And we in ADRA Canada, with the support of Canadians from coast to coast and Global Affairs Canada, have been involved in relief and development projects in the last 5 years in over 56 countries, touching the lives of over 6.1 million people.
So you've been involved in other big relief efforts, Hurricane Katrina, for example.
Yes, our counterparts in the U.S. were involved with that, and more recently we've been involved with the Syrian crisis in Syria and in Lebanon and now in Greece. Been involved in the Ukraine conflict, helping to rehabilitate families and communities. Also in Myanmar from the floods, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, Typhoon Pamela in the South Pacific, the list goes on.
Right. How did the collaboration with the Alberta government come about for this disaster?
Well, the Seventh Adventist Church in Alberta was responding immediately, as of course many other good organizations and faith-based organizations were also doing. And as we talked with the local organizations, we mentioned our particular expertise in managing the flow-through of donated goods. And the Alberta government decided that we were a natural fit to take over this piece of the response.
And how much is the organization being paid to do this work?
There is a grant which is coming from the government to handle some of the logistical costs, but most of the activity is done by volunteers. So hundreds of people have already been involved, and we're looking for hundreds of thousands more in the months to come.
Right. So we heard today the figure is $1 million. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And so it seems like a lot of money. So tell people how those taxpayer dollars will be used.
That's covering the cost of the warehouse, all of the necessary infrastructure, making sure that we've got meals for the volunteers, and the trucking continues. And we have a few paid staff also, just for the term of the project itself.
Okay, which is how long?
Well, for the moment, it's up until the end of January.
Okay.
But this will be an ongoing conversation to see what actually needs to be done.
Right. Now, clearly, ADRA Canada is religious. It's operated by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Do religious teachings come with the help that you give?
No, it does not, except that we believe that we are all responsible to each other as brothers and sisters in this world. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church, through ADRA Canada, does not proselytize or make any distinction. The only thing that we're concerned about is whether people are in poverty or distress. That's our mandate, and we aim to help. We work in communist countries, Buddhist countries, Hindu countries, Muslim countries, even Christian countries, wherever the need is, whatever the community is, we're there to help.
Okay. So as we mentioned, donations are pretty much always still needed. So what are some of the top items that you were looking for?
Definitely the things that would be needed for a home. If you imagine that you were a resident of Fort McMurray and all of a sudden you have no home to go home to, then you would want bedding, you'd want utensils, you'd want clothes. Pet owners want things for their pets. Families want things for their children. So we already have had good donations of disposable diapers and other such things. So all of the household items and so forth that you can imagine, we're already receiving, and we need much more of.
Okay, so if you want to donate or if people want to volunteer, how can they get involved?
Certainly go to the Alberta government website, go to the ADRA Canada website, go to ADRA Canada on Facebook, and you will certainly find us there.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking with us about this tonight.
It's a pleasure to be back home in Edmonton. Thank you, Adrienne.
All right. James Astleford is the Executive Director of ADRA Canada, the group that is taking the reins of donations for Fort McMurray wildfire victims.
So yes, I was back home in Edmonton because that's the city in which I was born. And now something more for the work that we were doing around the world at that time. If you've been to my home, you will have seen this picture in my office. It's a picture that looks deceptively simple, but there's something behind it. Because this is a village in Niger, in the Sahara, in the Sahel. And there was a terrible famine across the Sahel. And in partnership with the Canadian Food Grains Bank, ADRA Canada responded. The Canadian Food Grains Bank, by the way, is one of the good news stories for us here in Canada. It's 15 faith-based organizations representing some 30 different denominations, Catholics, Adventists, Baptists, Pentecostals, Presbyterian, you name it, are all involved. All working together to eliminate hunger, and all working together under the banner of Christ to make a difference. So we were working in this particular village. Everyone looked, when I came to visit, very well dressed. I noticed it was almost as if they were going to attend a wedding or something. And so I asked my ADRA Niger colleagues, why have we picked this village to come help? Looks like these people are very wealthy and they don't need our help. And they said, no, you don't understand. These people are in desperate need. But when they heard of our visit, that you were coming yourself to visit them, they all got dressed up in their wedding clothes to meet you. So I felt rather humbled by that. But anyway, we went about what we were doing, which was to have a food distribution. And we unloaded the trucks and the grains of food, beans and corn and such. And our colleagues went about their business carefully making a distribution to make sure that everyone got what they needed. Once the distribution was finished and we were packing up the trucks to go home, I saw the children descending on the place where we had had the distribution. And they had brought bowls from home, and they were sifting through the sand to find any stray beans or kernels of corn that had missed and fallen to the ground. And I suddenly realized these children were hungry, and they wanted to make sure that there was one more meal. They weren't going to let anything go to waste. And so they took them home and made a difference. And I thought, if our supporters in the 15 different church-based organizations in Canada, including the Adventist Church, could see these children, they would know that supporting the Food Grains Bank, supporting ADRA Canada, really does make a difference. What more could I tell you about what we were involved with in those years? Because we had projects in Myanmar, Mongolia, Brazil, Cambodia, Haiti, Japan, Lebanon, Syria, especially the Philippines. And by the way, some people ask me, do you get matching for your donations? You know, we Canadians, our national religion is BOGO. So we want that to happen with our donations too. We want our dollar to turn into $2 at least. Well, you know, with our Philippines response, each dollar turned into about $10. Because with the donations that came to ADRA Canada, we were then able to go to the Canadian government and to the Canadian Food Grains Bank and say, look, we're doing this, what can you do? And we got significant grants, especially from the Canadian government, that helped us to multiply the support that came from our congregations across Canada. We worked in Rwanda, Ukraine. Yes, we were working there when there was conflict, before this present conflict started. Kurdistan, places where ADRA made a positive difference. But then in 2019, it was back to East Africa again, the country that I actually grew up in. After I was born here in Alberta, my parents moved to Kenya. So it was back again to this land that Gwen and I love so much. You can see on the left some Turkana people, gorgeously arrayed, and tall as tall can be. I always felt very small amongst the Turkana and the Maasai. They all towered above me. And not only they, but you'll notice this anthill is towering above me too. You know, we think ants are very little creatures, but what they build sometimes is pretty tall. And we helped with various projects. Always in the ADRA mode is that we invariably start with some relief response, but then we get involved with the community and turn our relationship into development, helping them to make a difference. And I can tell you that being involved in ADRA, you have a wide range of experiences. So I have spent time digging ditches with villagers. I have had dinner at Rideau Hall with the Governor General, and everything in between. So you never know what's going to happen next in ADRA. In conclusion, our church, your church, has so many ministries, and I'm proud of them all. Radio, television, schools, hospitals, they all deserve our support, and the Spirit undoubtedly impresses you with different ones that you want to engage with. And we need to engage with them all. We also have ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency. That, as was mentioned in the video, works in over 100 countries and touches the lives of something like 20 million people every year. I don't think there's any other activity of our church that touches the lives of that many people every year. And all of those people are finding out about the God that we serve that loves them. And this wonderful story is all about a ministry. And I think of how God has led in the development of this ministry. Some of you may have this book, Faith to Change the World. And if you don't, why not contact ADRA Canada and see if you can get a copy? It was for sale. Maybe they'll give it to you for free. I don't know. But it tells the story of Pastor John Howard and his life. And about the last half of the book inevitably tells the story of how ADRA Canada became his passion. And it was born here in Alberta. Because Pastor Howard was working here. He tried to get some money from the Alberta government. He was successful to do a project in India. Eventually, he was invited to move to the union office in Ontario. Do we have time for this? Yes. You know, he was promised a sum of money from a certain part of our church to start ADRA Canada. And he moved all his belongings and his wife and family to Ontario, to Oshawa. And once he arrived, he was told, that money is not going to be given to you. And he thought, how are we going to start ADRA? Well, he had a plan to go to Ottawa to see the people in our government who make grants available. And he thought, well, I might as well go anyway. So he made his way to Ottawa and he spoke with various people. And when the meetings were finished, he left and he started down the corridor. And somebody ran after him and said, oh, by the way, Mr. Howard, we've been talking about your group of people, and we think you need a little extra help. And we've decided to give you X dollars as you get started here in Canada. X dollars was precisely the amount of money that had been promised but withdrawn. And Pastor Howard said, I have no choice. God is in this. He's making it possible for me to start this ministry. And so he did. Those of us who have been involved with ADRA and have traveled to the world and seen our various offices and the teams of our volunteers and staff who encounter terrible and often difficult circumstances, they've seen the tremendous commitment by these people who do not hesitate to commit to the agency. And often, these are people who are not of our faith, but who believe in what we do and who are responsive to what we do. Do you sense the passion and the commitment, the people that we partner with, the people in villages, communities, hunts, and refugee tents? Refugee tents. What does that remind me of? Yes, one of my colleagues in the Middle East visiting the refugees in tents, and he noticed that they all had a bunch of keys hanging in the entranceway of their tent. And finally, he couldn't stand it anymore, and he asked somebody, he said, why do you all have keys? For tents don't have locks. Why do you have a bunch of keys handy? And they said, well, you know, these are the keys to our homes. And we hope to go home one day. So we hang the keys there to remind us that we want to go home. And these are the people that we can help, and we do help with our projects. So, how can you support ADRA? You know, there's going to be a takeaway from a presentation like this. First of all, and I say this with all sincerity, I ask you to pray for ADRA. I believe that prayers make the difference between ADRA being just an ordinary agency and being a highly successful one. Why is it that we keep getting grants and extra sources of money that multiply the donations that you give? I believe, like the widow's mite, it's because God blesses, and our prayers can make that difference. Now, I know we may not have many young people here today, but pass the word on. If someone's looking for a dynamic challenge career-wise, consider being involved with ADRA somewhere in the world. And many different skills are needed, but obviously particularly the skill of community development, for which you have to go to school and get a degree in order to be a professional. And then, of course, you know this is coming. Financial support is so vital to all of our ministries, and in particular to ADRA Canada. And I believe the best way to support is through an automatic monthly donation. You can sign up, put your credit card details in, and say how much you want to give every month. And then every month you don't have to think about it. Your credit card just automatically. And you know, you always pay off your credit card, so somehow that donation just goes. And if you only sign up for $10 a month, you know, by the end of the year you've given $120. And you probably wouldn't have given $120 if I had asked you to, but you would have given the 10. Of course, you can also sign up for 50, 100, 1,000, you know, depending what your circumstances are. But the financial support, especially the monthly donations, makes it possible for ADRA Canada to exist and therefore to attract the support that it gets from the government and from other organizations like Canadian Food Grains Bank that I mentioned. So those are the ways that I think of that in which you can be involved with the ministry of ADRA if you're not an employee or a volunteer. Of course, I heard very clearly the reading of the scripture reading this morning, and I hope you did too, from Matthew 25, in which the Lord very clearly showed that he was not going to have an examination at the end on the 27 or 28 fundamental beliefs. All he was going to ask is if we cared for our sister and brother in need. And so we have also the text, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In all the time that I spent in ADRA, the one moment in which I felt most humbled and most thrilled was on a visit to one of our projects in Rwanda. And this was a project in which we, along with Canadian government funding, were able to help thousands of people in hundreds of different villages. In Rwanda, I think it was over 100 different villages that we were helping to grow more food so that they could eat 3 meals a day instead of just, maybe 1 a day. And we visited this one village that was entirely a Muslim village. And as we got ready to go, the leader of the agricultural community said, just a minute, I want to pray for you. And I thought, she's a Muslim, and she wants to pray for me and for ADRA Christians? And sure enough, she raised her hands to heaven and called upon Allah to bless ADRA and to bless us for what we had done. And of course, in my vocabulary, Allah is God. And I thought, she's praying to God. She calls him Allah. And these people are realizing God's presence in their lives as a result of our ministries. I hope that you will find the same commitment in your life to this ministry of ADRA. Thank you. Asked to commit ourselves to you, our feet, our hands, our hearts, our possessions. And as we have studied in the Sabbath school lessons for the adults in this quarter, we're learning that by committing to you, we are blessed beyond what we can imagine. Today we have prayed for the missing medical missionaries in the Philippines. I also want to bring in prayer to you all the some 6,000 Adventist employees around the world and all the many thousands of volunteers involved in projects in so many countries, trying to make a difference and at the same time show that you care. Thank you for loving us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.